Yes, our session is on articulating local and indigenous knowledge with science. The participants include myself, Robert Miller, Glenn Shepard, Simone Ataiji, and Joanna Wapishana. We've taken an indigenous model, and so we're all going to talk at you. So my section is going to be pretty brief. Just to give you a rundown of the presentation outline, we're focusing on indigenous lands. One aspect of that is cultural heritage, including deep cultural heritage, and how biodiversity corridors can be maintained by linking them, ethno-management plans created with indigenous people, ethnobotanical studies, participatory studies aimed at ground truthing information we collect remotely, as well as monitoring and conservation, the critical element of ethics in development and how we maintain the good life, not only for ourselves, but indigenous people, and of course, lessons learned and future directions. Just to summarize some of the drivers we were looking at, we're all familiar with the top two, deforestation and climate change, but also as major infrastructural projects are developed, dams, it's not just deforesting, but it's flooding forests that create massive problems, and mining and other extractive frontiers created alongside them. General biocultural degradation, loss of language, culture, socio-ecological systems. Indigenous people are on the cusp of an existential crisis, losing fundamentally their basic ways of life, and the violation of indigenous rights more violently through struggles that I think we're all familiar with. My component of this is looking at the deep history of cultural heritage. And one of the points that we have to recognize is we really don't know what Amazonian biodiversity is. We studied it from the point of view of the present, but what archaeology over the past 2 decades and indigenous history with indigenous people has demonstrated, many of those areas that we treat as natural are actually anthropogenic for us, and we need to incorporate that into our model. For instance, here you see, this is a model based on the distribution of so-called terrapraticites across the Amazon. It seems mutually exclusive to what we consider to be one of the highest biodiversity areas in the Amazon. This is high biodiversity because when people talk about biodiversity, they talk about species richness and forget oftentimes that biodiversity includes functional biodiversity or ecosystemic biodiversity. And actually, this area, which is, as we know, the most threatened area of the Amazon, is also the most complex with the greatest degree of functional biodiversity. So we have to recognize that. And this is just a map that you're all familiar with. This from TNC of indigenous areas in purple and the other conservation areas in different colors of orange. The little red dots are what I call hope spots, borrowing from the United Nations, the move from environmental hotspots to socio-ecological hope spots. And that brings me to this next slide here, very familiar image. Dan, a co-author on this with Ricardo Swati Studio. This is what the Amazon was like in 2006. Here's what it's going to be in 2050. Well, best of luck on that one, because one of the things that hadn't happened at that point is the horrible sequence of centennial droughts. 2005, 2007, 2010, 2014, 15, and 16, they had immense almost 1 million hectares of forest fires within the indigenous park. So that little patch right there with climate change actually is not going to be a very successful area to manage it. We know this. We took a pollen core from right there, and 3,000 years ago, in the middle of the warmest period of the Holocene, the mid-Holocene warming period, this was savanna. This was primarily grass. So we know it happened. But there's something here, and we'll be talking about this tonight, our work with the Kwikuru. Bruno Franchetto is here, Webb Dorshaw, we're also going to be talking. It's the longest running program in participatory mapping and participatory science and education in the Amazon, starting in 1976 with linguistic documentation, cultural heritage mapping in the early 90s, and then indigenous education and whatnot. And here is an idea of putting through GIS, through geospatial science, which is something indigenous people grasp on immediately, creating hubs, ArcGIS hubs, within these hope spots, and putting the force of science in the hands of the indigenous people themselves. But I'm going to leave off there and pass it over to Robert to go into the next segment.
Okay, good morning. I'm going to skip the introductions and go right into it. So when I was invited to a session on indigenous peoples and lands in this idea of tools and bridging scientific and traditional knowledge, what really just popped up as the most relevant thing is this idea of the ethno-management plans that are in fact, they are tools, and they also are this bridge of different kinds of knowledge. So let me talk about that very briefly. Glenn, our stopwatch. Okay.
Oh, you went back to the beginning.
Oh dear. 2. Okay. So ethno-management plans, they basically work on 3 questions for indigenous people. What was our land before? So it's a look into the past. What is it today? And this is where environmental remote sensing is very important, because you can look at satellite images and figure out what's going on. And not just internally with natural resources, but with neighbors and impacts of dams and highways and logging and poachers, and try to map all that. And then this is part of the ethno-mapping stage, where people sit down around satellite images. And then the management plan has to do with what do we want our land to be like in the future. So it's this question that brings the discussion. Okay. So in the mapping stage, you have this bridge of technology, traditional knowledge, and generally it's the elders who know more about the land. They know it like the palm of their hands, and the young people who have better knowledge and grasp of things like cell phones and GPS. And so this is a very important dialogue, and as Stephen Firth said this morning, which I like, getting people together is a goal in itself. Good stuff. So this is what's going on behind it. Often this process is more important than the actual management plan in itself, this process of dialogue. And this I remembered that I thought that if I have a publication in Portuguese on this subject, if anyone is interested, I have a few. And I can also get you a PDF in English if you give me an address. So just some thoughts. As I said, the process is often more important than the final product. It catalyzes this community discussion. And also the plan can be a lever to access public policies. And we have several accounts of where indigenous people have gone in to speak to like local mayors or people like that. And the conversation is sort of weak until they pull out their management plan and say, well, look, a lot of this we already have planned out. And that just changes the discussion to a whole nother level. And finally, because although someone said we're all converted here, but there's Protestants and Lutherans and Methodists. So for the conservationists, we looked at 60 management plans in Amazonia, and we found that there are a lot of categories of internal protected areas. If you look at Brazil's SNUCI, the system of conservation units, you have extremely protected, lightly protected, and they're all there. So you have protected streams, lakes for protecting fish populations and this and that. But pragmatically, most of them have to do with protecting protein stocks. But the message here is that they are protecting their land. So I think that's the message I wanted to bring, was that indigenous peoples are very important or crucial stewards of the Amazonian environment.
So on that note, given the fact that over half of protected areas in the Amazon are indigenous areas, it makes sense, both in terms of sheer efficiency and also in terms of just basic ethics and decency, that scientists and conservation scientists should dialogue with indigenous, not only indigenous communities, but their ways of knowing the Amazon. And so there's been a whole series of studies going back to the 1970s looking at indigenous habitat classification systems in different places in the Amazon. And you find a lot of very interesting overlaps between indigenous habitat classification systems and scientific systems. And I've done, I'm off camera. And so I've done, myself and my students have done a number of studies of what we call ethnobotanical ground truthing, where you take you map out, using some of the same ethnomapping techniques, specific habitat vegetation zones that indigenous people recognize and the parameters they use to classify the landscape. And then you go and look at those habitat types using floristic studies, ecological structure studies, and satellite images. And what we found is that in several different locations, the indigenous classification system for habitat types, for vegetative types, is often at least as sophisticated, if not more sophisticated, than the existing scientific strategy mapping of that region. And you can actually use indigenous knowledge to ground truth satellite images and to streamline biodiversity surveys. Now, indigenous science is not the same as Western science. It's based on different epistemological and ontological claims, both about the mythical past and also about the current present, which for Amazonian indigenous peoples often involves shamanic interactions with the environment. And as one example, the Machinga people of Peru, where I've worked for a long time, there's a certain forest type, that they recognize that it's a forest type that's created by the interaction between a certain kind of ant and a plant species, Cordia nodosa, and basically the ant clears out the area around the base of the plant in exchange for housing. And for the Machinga people, this is a shamanic space. They know about the ant and the ecological interaction, and they see the clearings, but they say when the shaman goes here taking psychoactive plants, this turns into a huge village. And the shaman can go there and get new manioc varieties and new medicinal plant varieties from these spirit beings. And they point out, they say, well, look, see these burnt trees? This is because the spirits make their gardens like we do, and they burn their gardens every year, and there's these burnt areas on the trees. And my entomologist friend dug his cutting shears into that thing and found that these trees were full of ants, full of Normalochista ants. And actually he discovered there was a new scientific discovery about ant galling trees that goes back to old debates between Spruce and Wallace about whether ants gall trees or not. And so, you have a sort of a metaphorical understanding of ecological process that becomes reflective in these shamanic concepts. And sometimes even these shamanic concepts that you wouldn't think would have any sort of importance for real science can have a scientific knowledge in the background. But this doesn't mean that all of indigenous science has to map directly onto Western science, because our real reasons for working with indigenous peoples should be ethical and moral and political commitment to preserving their lands. Another effort that I've been involved in is in participatory hunting management strategies in Manu National Park. And in this project that ran for 3 years, we worked with 99 different hunters in Manu National Park. We had 3 years of continuous data collection. When you work with indigenous peoples, you greatly increase your observational capacity. One PhD student in the field for 1 year has a limited number of transects they can walk. Well, you've got 100 hunters working with you. We ended up, over the 3 year period, the indigenous hunters using pictorial data collection tools. They registered over 4,300 hunts, 30 tons of game animals hunted over the 3 year collection period. And we found, and by spatializing this data, we found that 41% of all the animals that they hunted were hunted within 500 meters of their homes. And this idea of the fact that they participated in the data collection meant that when the results came back, they were much more confident in the results. We focus a lot on deforestation. If we can eliminate deforestation, all the problems are solved. This isn't always the case. There's a natural gas pipeline in Peru called the Camisea gas line. It's been very widely promoted. It's the roadless model of deforestation. None other than Bruce Babbitt gave his stamp of approval. And yet, although the Camisea gas pipeline is all helicopters and boats, there's no roads. Although there's no road building, there's all of these socioeconomic and ecological changes in native communities. There's been heavy river traffic, the fish populations are dropping, there's been pipeline bursts, and the people are complaining about loss of fish, loss of game animals, and then just a general sort of social cultural loss associated with economic development. So although stopping deforestation is important, it's not the only factor, and you have to look at these more diffuse, unanticipated effects of development as well.
So hi everyone. I also want to remind you that we have worked previously before the meeting and we produced a concept paper. It's still a work in progress where we articulate our ideas on this panel on articulating indigenous and scientific knowledge for conservation development. And I think a very important topic after Mike talked about, the biocultural memory. How biocultural memory plays out into landscapes, into biocultural landscapes that we need to preserve. So it's not only preserving the system, it's the whole biocultural system that we're talking about. And some of these ideas come from indigenous knowledge itself. For example, the system concept, the well-being, the good life concept. So I think it's very important for us to consider ethics when we're doing research. It's an important agenda for researchers to embrace. We need to teach our people in academia, in universities about ethics and their respect of those knowledge systems that we're working with. Not only indigenous, but traditional peoples as well. We here are focusing more on indigenous peoples, but we also want to bring importance of considering traditional peoples, riverine communities, and people that manage the system, extractive reserves and river patterns. So we also are concerned about epistemic justice, of considering different knowledge systems in the same way and valuing them in our planning, in the way we do research. So we want to propose that as an agenda for us to work more in the future. I think that each one of these sessions or even sub-sessions could end up in another like follow-up workshop or something to really distill the ideas more deeply. And also embracing decolonizing concepts. Such as the buen vivir, the good life. It's the concept that comes from indigenous peoples and we brought into now science and we're developing it. So, and it has been included in some countries, in Bolivia, for example, constitution, as we know it. Talking about infrastructure development, it's a big driver, as we know. And many of sessions here in this meeting are going to be approaching this topic. One thing that we are concerned is that most of these plans and the inventories and environmental impact assessments are not considering or incorporating traditional and local indigenous knowledge in the planning and in the monitoring and also in the management plan. So we have these tools, but they are somehow disconnected in the implementation of these big projects. And I think there is opportunity to learn from the different Amazonian countries on how we can better integrate these tools towards mitigating the impacts, towards planning better the matrix, even before the energy matrix, even before implementing these projects, why we need that, why we're going to build them, and having the dialogue with local indigenous peoples as well. That's a public hearing in the Belo Monte. You can see the amount of stakeholders that need to be involved in this decision making. Also talks back to what Cynthia was discussing on how to incorporate. It needs to be from the start. It can't be using the colonizing concepts. We kind of need to open that space for dialogue. Here I just brought an example of the Telespires Dam, which was built in a region that it has a high biodiversity significance, but also biocultural significance. And you can see here the mother of fish. The mother of fish lives in the headwaters of the rivers. And this was used in one of the lawsuits that was applied towards better dialogue between the companies and indigenous peoples and the consultation process. We have a problematic right now consultation process that we need to address as well. The free, prior, informed consent policy needs to really be deeply understood and applied in different contexts. So that's another opportunity, and we're going to be talking more about that in tomorrow's session. Some of the also designations for the places. We need to understand those designations, why they're designated like that, and then linguistics play a very important role. So valuing those languages is fundamental. So just wrapping up, it's a lot to wrap up in this session, and then we kind of try to synthesize main strategies and tools, and then thinking about looking forward as well. We also see the importance of learning from cases and using the cases and using the stories to learn in a space that is a safe space to learn, where you bring indigenous peoples, you bring scientists, but like open space, not with the concepts already pre-designed, but with being eager to learn from each other. Process-oriented. We're not in the beginning or not in the end. We are in the middle, and we have a lot of path to cover. The connection with other stakeholders, the connection with public prosecutors and governance, so the multi-stakeholder platforms are very important. Also, one thing that was brought by Indigenous peoples is more autonomy to Indigenous peoples. Today you have many important leaders, you have Indigenous peoples that are, academic trained. We need to value those peoples and leaders and bring them more to the dialogue. And have this concept then to more transdisciplinary dialogue and the two-way dialogue. We saw some of the main tools that are used. And in our paper, we talk more about these tools and how they could use not only as a knowledge tool, but as a tool to bring the local knowledge also to the academic realm. And with that, I thank you. And I will pass to Joanna. She's going to share a little bit of her perspective in the Raposa Serra do Sol and how that articulation between Indigenous and scientific knowledge have helped or not the management of her land. So I ask for 5 more minutes for Joanna, if that's okay with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. I tried to speak in English, but we have some Portuguese. Sorry. And first of all, Indigenous people technology and rights and values are important for this discussion and for creating strategic arts. And without Indigenous land, it is not impossible to conserve biodiversity and to keep people there in the life in the world. So this is important for us to keep the rights, especially when you talk in Amazon. So because you sometimes use some strategy like scientists, like mapping, Robert said about the monitoring the land, we put some data in mapping. We use this to defend Raposa Serra do Sol land. And for example, we in past, the Raposa Serra do Sol land had a lot of dam and the monoculture and rice of plantation. And for several years, the rice of plantation created negative impact in the indigenous land, especially in the rivers in Amazon. So this is Roraima. This is Raposa Serra do Sol, and start the Amazon. Yeah, and have a lot of river there, and a lot of river born here. And in past, they have monoculture of the rice, usually a lot of agrotoxic, and put in the river, and several people drink the water. It's too damaged for us. And we can see in the map, when the plantation of the rice grow for several years. No? It's good for us to show for authority in Brazil, especially in the tribunal, and prove. And this is kind of the scientist research and and the minister could see this in the map. So it's one example. And another, for us, have many species in the, especially in this area in Roraima. We argue for people, it is important the land to conserve the life, especially in some bird species there, and like fish too. Is Jews have here in this area. So we prove for them it's important to keep this land for indigenous, because the indigenous people use the traditional knowledge to conserve this species and to give more protection. And so I think for me, I would like to see give some observation in this presentation before finishing. I think for you have to combine indigenous values, indigenous knowledge, and scientific knowledge. Sometimes I see in a university, they see for indigenous values in traditional knowledge is more inferior. It's ego for us, especially when we talk about climate change use. No? Because for a long time, indigenous peoples, leaders, see this. Now, if you don't take care of the land, if you don't take care of the Amazon, in future, they could be collapsed in the world. It's happening now. Now, you see deforestation, you see degradation, you see the problem in the water. The people see this. Why? Because they see more spiritual and traditional knowledge. But for science, you can't prove this. But prove if you see the religion, the spiritual, you feel this. So you observe and they change, not in the world. For some people who study this, need proof. But for indigenous people, just pay attention. Pay attention when you have the time, you pay attention in your life. So for us, it's strategic to combine technology and science. For this reason, you need to protect the indigenous land, demarcation, support the indigenous peoples, defend their rights, indigenous organizations to participate in this kind of discussion, especially when involve indigenous youth. You need to combine two things. The first rights, the first biodiversity, the first people, the first Amazon. It's kind of strategic. We have more than 118 million hectares in Brazil. The land, the indigenous land, 98% is in Amazon. It's indigenous land, 118 million hectares. You need to consider this. It's kind of data. You have to invest, not just research, not just study, but invest to protect this. Protect and support indigenous initiative, indigenous skill, indigenous plan, indigenous monitoring, involve, be partner, not just for study, but involve more this kind of the affirmative. Thank you.